June 6, 1989, Jefferson County, Colorado, 16 miles northwest of Denver. The FBI agents arrived before sunrise, 85 of them moving in convoy across the high plains, their headlights cutting through pre-dawn dark. They carried warrants, they carried evidence bags, they carried weapons. What they did not carry was any expectation of what they were about to find inside the most contaminated industrial facility in the United States, a place that had been operating for 37 years inside a residential corridor surrounded by suburbs, next to schools, downwind of a city of 500,000 people. A place the workers called, without irony, the plant. The Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant in Colorado made the plutonium triggers for every nuclear warhead in the American arsenal. Not some of them, all of them. From 1952 until the morning those FBI agents pulled into the parking lot, this 16-square-mile complex in Jefferson County manufactured the fissile cores that made American hydrogen bombs function. The workers were proud of that. Proud of the precision, proud of the secrecy, proud of the fact that what they built in the machining rooms of Building 771 was the reason the Cold War stayed cold. They were told it was safe. They were told the containment held. They were told that what they breathed in the corridors of the plutonium processing wing, the fine metallic dust suspended in recycled air, the invisible particles shed by fuel rods and processing drums, was within acceptable limits. Acceptable limits that the Atomic Energy Commission had set. Acceptable limits that nobody had tested on human lung tissue for longer than a decade. What the workers were not told, what they could not have known because the records that would have told them had been locked inside a classification system that answered to nobody, was that the plant had been burning its own waste in open pits since the early 1950s, and that the smoke from those fires had been drifting southeast toward Denver for longer than most of them had been alive. Rocky Flats was created by necessity, the way most weapons facilities of its era were created, by panic. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device in August 1949, 4 years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. Within months, the Atomic Energy Commission was searching for production sites, and the land west of Denver was cheap, isolated enough for secrecy, and close enough to existing rail infrastructure. Ground broke in 1951. The first plutonium machining operations began in 1952. By 1953, Rocky Flats was the primary production site for the W-25 nuclear warhead component, and the men who worked there understood two things clearly. What they were making mattered, and what they were making could kill them if they were careless. What they did not understand, what the Atomic Energy Commission and later the Department of Energy had gone to considerable effort to ensure they would not understand, was that the danger was not contingent on carelessness. The plant at its peak employed 7,000 workers. At shift change, the parking lots filled with pickup trucks and family sedans. Men came in from Denver, from Arvada, from Wheat Ridge. They wore dosimeters clipped to their breast pockets, small film badges that measured radiation exposure, and they trusted those numbers the way a miner trusts a canary. They signed secrecy agreements before their first shift. They were warned about what they could and could not discuss with their families. They were not warned about the 1957 fire in Building 771, when plutonium-contaminated filters ignited and burned for 13 hours, releasing a plume of radioactive smoke that settled across the eastern suburbs of Denver. The official public statement described the incident as minor. The internal reports, which were classified and remained classified for decades, described something considerably different. The work was precise, skilled, and deeply masculine in the way that dangerous industrial work often is. The machining of plutonium pits required tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch. The men who did it were craftsmen in the oldest sense of the word. They knew their machines intimately. They understood the material in ways that could not be reduced to a manual, and they took a craftsman's pride in the quality of what they produced. The components that left Rocky Flats in lead-lined containers, moving by secure convoy to assembly facilities across the country, were the tightest machined objects in American manufacturing. The workers knew that. In the lunchroom, there was a quality of satisfaction that came from making something that required everything you had. What was happening to their bodies in the years they spent inside Building 771, the microscopic particles of plutonium that lodged in the soft tissue of the lung and remained there, irradiating a fixed point of cellular structure for the remainder of a man's life, was not something they could see or feel or measure with any instrument they were given access to. By the 1960s, Rocky Flats was processing more plutonium per year than any other facility in the Western world. Production quotas came down from Washington, driven by the logic of nuclear deterrence. More warheads, more triggers, faster production cycles. The plant expanded. Building 771 was joined by Building 776 and Building 777. The waste streams grew. Plutonium-contaminated cutting oil, contaminated metal shavings, contaminated gloves and protective clothing, all of it requiring disposal, all of it radioactive for longer than any human institution had ever managed to remain coherent. The documented solution, for years, was drums. Steel drums, stacked in outdoor storage areas, holding thousands of gallons of contaminated solvent. In summer, the drums swelled in the Colorado heat. Some of them leaked. Some of them were stored near drainage channels that ran toward Woman Creek and Walnut Creek, waterways that fed into the reservoir system serving the Denver metropolitan area. Whether anyone in authority knew the drums were leaking at the time is a question the records have never answered cleanly. The decision to involve the FBI did not come from the Department of Energy, which operated Rocky Flats. It came from a grand jury, impaneled in 1989 after years of pressure from environmental groups and a single determined federal prosecutor named Ken Fimberg, who had read enough of the available documentation to believe that what was happening at Rocky Flats was not merely a regulatory failure, it was criminal. The June 1989 raid produced 960 boxes of documents. It produced evidence of deliberate, documented violations of environmental law, illegal nighttime incineration of radioactive waste, concealed from state and federal regulators by a practice of burning only after dark, when the smoke would be harder to trace and the monitoring inspectors had gone home. It produced evidence that Rockwell International, the contractor operating the facility on behalf of the Department of Energy, had known about the contamination problems for years. What the raid produced next, what happened in the months and years after those 85 agents walked out of Rocky Flats carrying their 960 boxes, is where the story of Rocky Flats stops being the story of a contaminated factory and becomes something else entirely. The grand jury met for 3 years. They heard testimony from workers, from scientists, from contractors. They reviewed the document cache. They voted to indict. They voted to indict Rockwell International and several Department of Energy officials on felony charges. The indictments were never filed. The Department of Justice, over the explicit and documented objection of the grand jurors themselves, negotiated a plea agreement with Rockwell that resulted in an $18.5 million fine, a sum that represented, for a defense contractor of Rockwell's size, something in the range of 2 weeks of operating profit. No individual was charged, no official faced prosecution. The grand jurors were bound by secrecy rules that prevented them from speaking publicly. One of them, a woman named Wes McKinley, spent years afterward trying to get the sealed grand jury report released to the public. The report, as of the last available public record, has never been fully released. The plant closed in 1992. The official reason given was the end of the Cold War and a reduced need for warhead production. Whether the environmental liability played a role in the closure decision is, again, a question the available documentation does not answer definitively. The Department of Energy spent the next 10 years and approximately $7 billion on cleanup operations, the largest nuclear remediation project in American history. The official position at the conclusion of that cleanup was that Rocky Flats was safe for use as a wildlife refuge. That wildlife refuge opened to the public in 2018. It sits on 5,000 acres of land that was, for 40 years, the primary plutonium processing site in the United States. The workers who spent their careers in Building 771, the machinists, the chemical operators, the maintenance crews, filed health claims for decades. The records of those claims and the patterns they revealed are not publicly summarized in any single accessible document. What researchers who have examined individual cases have found is a cluster of cancers, lung cancer, brain cancer, bone cancer, at rates that independent epidemiologists have described as elevated above what would be expected in a comparable, non-exposed population. The Department of Energy's own studies produced results that the department described as inconclusive. The gap between what the workers believed had happened to them and what the government was willing to put in writing is the gap that has never been officially closed. The fence around the old production site is still there. The main buildings were demolished during the cleanup, their rubble processed and interred in an on-site disposal cell. What remains above ground is grass and trails and the silence of high plains that have been contaminated to a degree that the cleanup contractors themselves acknowledge they could only partially address. The plutonium that could not be removed, the particles too deeply embedded in soil and rock to be economically extracted, has a half-life of 24,100 years. It will remain in the ground beneath that wildlife refuge long after every institution that put it there has ceased to exist, long after every document that recorded how it got there has turned to dust. The names of the workers who died are not collected in any single official record. The grand jury report that might have answered some of the questions about what was known and when remains sealed. What the FBI found in those 960 boxes on the morning of June 6, 1989, has never been fully accounted for in public. Whether the contamination of the Denver airshed, the leaking drums, the illegal nighttime burns, whether all of that was the result of deliberate concealment or institutional negligence compounded across decades, is a question that the Department of Justice chose in 1992 not to let a jury answer. The dosimeters the workers wore measured external radiation. Nobody gave them a way to measure what was already inside.